Hello students, welcome back. We are done with the overview, section 1. Now let's go to section 2, data collection. This is an optional section, so if you're not interested, just skip it and go to section 3. Some sections are marked optional because they're too advanced, but in this case it's closer to the other way around. Yes, we're going to learn some new ideas and new terminologies, but hardly any of them is related to mathematics. At least not at this level. So what's the point? After all, this is a math course. However, on the other hand, this section provides some good motivations for statistical studies overall. So I decided to cover it as an optional topic, as a compromise. Here we go. Here's the first topic, observational studies versus designed experiments. Here's an example of an observational study. Please stop the playback and read through. Alright, done with reading? What's this all about? A group of researchers wants to study the possible connection between cell phone use and brain tumor. So they observed a large number of people for a number of years. And there are many people who have been using a lot of cell phones and also many people not using very much, and then compare their brain tumor cases. Alright, now here's an example of a designed experiment. Again, please stop the playback and read through. This time, the researchers are studying rats, not humans. And they divided these rats into two groups, and one group was exposed to radiation similar to cell phone, and then the other group, nothing. Otherwise, all the other living environments stay the same. And then they compare. So, what's the key difference between one and the other? Well, one thing that stands out is human versus animals, but as a matter of fact, that's not really the key issue. Yes, there are some ethical issues to concern, but we do have human experiments as well with volunteers. What is the key distinction between one and the other? In the observational study, the subject, these people decide their own lifestyles. The researchers do not mandate the use of cell phones. They just observe. Now let's go to the next example, designed experiments. Here, rats do not decide anything. Researchers decide everything. And they are in control. That's the big difference between one and the other. Here in the observational study, people decide their own lives, so the distinction between one variable and the other are kind of blurred, and there may be multiple variables together at work. And that kind of phenomena is called confounding, and we are going to talk about it later. So the result you get may not be very reliable. In designed experiments, it is possible to single out one important variable, in this case, cell phone radiation, and then keep everything else the same, and then study only that. So the result is far more reliable, but then again, there's an ethical issue here. In terms of statistical languages, we use these kind of terms. In an observational study, researchers measure the values of the variable that comes as a result, which they call response variable, without attempting to influence the variable or the possible cause, which they call explanatory variable. In this case, the cause, explanatory variable, is the cell phone radiation, and the result, response variable, is the brain tumor. In the designed experiment, on the other hand, researchers are in full control of the explanatory variable, and then they study the result, response variables. Alright, keep that in your mind, and let's go to an example problem. Again, stop the playback and read through. Question number 1. What is the explanatory variable and what is the respondent variable here? Question number 2. Is this an observational study or a designed experiment? What do you think? I think the second question is easier, so let's do that first. What do you think? Observational study or designed experiment? I hope everybody got it right. This is an observational study. Who made the decision about getting COVID infection or not? It was not mandated by anybody else. These people, the subject, made their own decision whether to get vaccine or not. So this is an observational study. Now, we had 2 observational studies about humans and then 1 designed experiment for lab rats. So maybe you're going to get some bad idea. Is it related to ethical issue? Not in general, as a matter of fact. Especially in pre-developmental stages, in phase 2 or phase 3 of the vaccines, the companies run designed experiments with people, of course volunteers. They get the volunteers and then randomly select who's going to get the real vaccine and who's going to get the fake vaccine, placebo, that does nothing. And then the result is kept in a vault. Nobody knows who's who, which is which. And then several weeks later, all the data are just combined and analyzed, and then compare those. That's how all those phase 2 and phase 3 developmental stage design experiments worked. But not in this case. Everything was pre-approved, so people decided their own lifestyle, vaccinated or not vaccinated. And then researchers observed. How did they observe? Well, they're looking at a number of COVID patients, and then one group got COVID even though they got vaccinated, the breakthrough cases. And then the second group did not get vaccine, so their usual infection. And then what does a comparison yield? The researchers found out heavier concentration of the South African variant, the beta variant, among the people who got vaccines, the breakthrough cases. And the conclusion, this vaccine by Pfizer and BioNTech is not as effective against the variant than the original. That was the conclusion. Now, do you agree? Of course you do. Nowadays everybody agrees, but at this time, March and April of 2021, that was a new result. So, let's come back to this question here. What is the explanatory variable and what is the respondent variable? What's the cause that divided one group and the other? And what's the result? The cause, one group and the other group, how are they separated? Vaccine or no vaccine? So that's the explanatory variable. Now, what's the respondent variable? What was the result? For vaccinated people, what? For unvaccinated people, what? Higher or lower concentration of South African variant. That's the respondent variable. Okay, so much for an example problem. And let's continue. We talked about confounding briefly. When we have observational studies, this can be a problem because it is difficult to single out one important variable and keep everything else the same. Here you go. Please stop the playback and read through. Here, a number of senior citizens that participated in this study had regular flu shots in one group and no flu shots on the other group. And then they studied, turned out 27% less likely to be hospitalized from influenza or pneumonia, and 48% less likely to die. Looks like this is a spectacular result toward the effectiveness of the flu vaccine. Well, I agree with the conclusion, but not completely agreeing with the numbers here, because something else might be at work, which we call lurking variable. So what's at work? Well, there can be many more, but one thing I can't think about is the lifestyle, because this is an observational study, not a designed experiment. These people chose their own lifestyles. Some people chose to get vaccinated, regular vaccines for 10 years, I think, yes, and that's because they must be more health conscious. So that mindset must have been reflected on their other lifestyles as well. How about the other group? These people did not get vaccines for 10 straight years, which means either they don't care, or they can't afford, or they are too much into those conspiracy theories and they don't trust science. In any case, it's far more likely that these people are living in less idealized lives in terms of health consciousness. And that may be also at work, not just vaccines, but something else as well. These kind of things are called confounding. And as a statistician, of course, you have to do some work to get around this kind of problem. How do you do that? We have to get some more mathematics involved, like these. Let's go with some lingos first before talking about some actual examples. A sampling is a process of selecting samples out of population. A bias refers to a systematic difference of traits between the sample and the population. Not just incidental difference, but a systematic difference. We're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail with an example a little bit later. Bear with me. A sampling frame refers to a list from which we can select a sample. It will be ideal if we have a list of everybody in the population, but that's very much impractical. Think about this. You want to get some presidential poll election result, but by the time you get the list of everybody, all the voters, all the registered voters, election must be over by then. So we have to resort to some sampling frame, which is much less than the population itself, yet it's a good representative of the population. And this can be very difficult and expensive and can be troublesome. Sample design refers to a strategy of sampling, and it can be classified like these. Probability samples, which use mathematics, versus judgment samples, like convenience samples or volunteer samples, they can be bad. Usually they are bad. And it can be done in single stage or multi-stage. Single stage is simpler and also superior, because if you have multi-stage, then at each stage we have uncertainty and the errors will multiply. So multi-stage is not very good in terms of mathematics, but it is very difficult to get a sample directly from the population because the sampling frame may be really bad. So we may have to resort to multi-stage, even though it's inferior. In this course, however, we are going to study only simple random sample. The random sample taken directly from the population. Why? Because that's the simplest, and also that's the best if possible. And finally, the knowledge of simple random sampling is necessary to understand multi-stage methods, because basically we are talking about many simple random samplings put together and read through by a stochastic process. So if you don't know simple random sampling, you don't understand multi-stage random sampling either. So in this course, in undergraduate level, simple random sample only. Remember that. Remember all these, and let's go to an example problem here. 1936 presidential election, Landon in landslide. Here are a couple of nice reading materials, and I have them open already. 1936 United States presidential election, everybody knows the result, is FDR, and he won big time. But not according to a magazine called Literary Digest. They called Landon in a landslide. Of course, it turned out the other way around. How? Literary Digest was a magazine that called four previous presidential elections correctly, so people trusted. What did they do? They selected people from a big list and then went from there. But then again, there was a problem. Even though they polled 10 million people, among which 2.27 million responded, humongous number. It must have been very, very expensive venture. But the sampling frame was bad. They relied upon something like telephone book. In 1936, come on, telephone is heavily favoring affluent people. And also lists from guests of big wedding, lists from country club membership, and so on and so forth. All those favor at least middle income to affluent people. So that created a systematic bias toward affluent people. And that's how they got it wrong. Another interesting aspect is, in the same election, a young researcher called George Gallup and his team used proper method and used only a fraction of sample size, only of 50,000, and they called it right, amazingly accurately as a matter of fact. And the rest is history. Nowadays, George Gallup is not really associated to an individual, just one mathematician, but now it is a big company, a huge company, one of the biggest statistical polling and surveying and analysis company in the world. That's how Gallup started, and that's how Literary Digest failed. Even yet, there were more blunders. Here's another interesting reading. Dewey defeats Truman. Here we go. Look at this picture. Harry Truman all smiles with a newspaper, Chicago Daily Tribune. Dewey defeats Truman. This is real newspaper. And it was an early edition. And then Chicago Tribune thought Dewey would win, but of course it was Harry Truman. So what happened? This wasn't much of a mathematical blunder as was previous example. This was more about legal blunder. You see, there's a law that the agencies cannot announce the poll result, the survey result, too close to the election day, because this kind of broadcast or reports may influence the election itself. And Truman was catching up, but Chicago Daily Tribune just kept the old record, and then they thought Truman would lose and ran a newspaper like this, and what an embarrassment. Of course, mathematically, you can say that you have to look at the trend as well as the point value, but then again, that's a bit difficult story. So at this point, we'll just simply say that, hey, it was a nice blunder, but it wasn't too much of a mathematical thing. At least let's call it at that. As for mathematical aspects, 2016 election has something more to think about. Most polls called Hillary Clinton beating Donald Trump, but it didn't turn out that way. How? Well, in summer of 2016, the supports for Donald Trump went down quite a bit because of a series of scandals, sex scandal and tax scandal, and many more. But then again, curiously, the support for Clinton did not rise. So what really happened? The people who withdrew support, at least in polling, in surveying, did not really withdraw their support. They just said nothing. Basically, they were saying, oh, I don't want to talk about it. They were not really withdrawing their support from Trump. In the election day, most of them actually voted for Trump anyway. And that was a surprise. So what happened mathematically? Rather inadvertently, a volunteer polling was mixed up into the random sampling. They intended random sampling, but a great portion of it turned out to be a volunteer sampling. And that's bad. And that's what happened. People didn't see at the time, but only after the election. Well, we have those kind of blunders here and there, and what we are trying to do is, of course, avoiding those kind of things and doing it right. That's what we are studying, and that's what the data collection is all about.